The Buddha versus Plato, Reality and Illusion, From the Cave to Nirvana. Imagine a group of people living their entire lives in a dark cavern. Chained in place, they face a blank wall watching shadows flicker from a fire burning behind them. For these prisoners, the dancing silhouettes on the wall are the only reality they have ever known. Now, imagine another scene. An Indian prince named Siddhartha sits beneath a Bodhi tree at night, determined not to rise until he finds ultimate truth. He has left behind a luxurious palace, renouncing comfort in search of something beyond the fleeting shadows of worldly pleasure. In his intense meditation, he confronts illusion and ignorance, seeking a light of understanding as transformative as the sun. Though separated by great distance and differing cultures, the Greek philosopher Plato and Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha both grappled with the nature of reality and illusion. Each in his own way asked, are the things we perceive around us real or merely shadows of a deeper truth? How can we awaken from our false perceptions and see things as they truly are? Plato's famous Allegory of the Cave and the Buddha's teachings on the nature of suffering and enlightenment both serve as profound metaphors for the human condition. They invite us to question what we take for granted as real and guide us toward liberation. One through philosophical reasoning, the other through spiritual insight. In this exploration, we will journey from the depths of Plato's cave to the Buddha's nirvana. We will compare how each wisdom tradition understands perception, reality, and illusion. Plato, through the dramatic imagery of prisoners and shadows, illustrates our ignorance and the difficult ascent to knowledge. The Buddha, through gentle but radical teachings, illuminates how clinging to impermanent phenomena creates a web of illusion and suffering. Along the way, we'll examine key concepts. Plato's distinction between the world of forms and the world of appearances, and the Buddha's insights into impermanence, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and non-self anattā. We'll see how Plato's ultimate truth, the form of the good like a sun outside the cave, compares with the Buddha's ultimate truth of nirvana, the extinguishing of illusion and craving. We'll also consider the paths each thinker offers to escape illusion, the philosophical education and rational inquiry of Plato versus the eightfold path of ethical living, meditation, and wisdom taught by the Buddha. The goal of this deep comparison is not to declare a winner between the Buddha and Plato, but to gain insight into two monumental attempts to answer the same fundamental human questions. What is real? Why do we suffer from illusions? How can we awaken to truth? By the end, we will appreciate the common quest that links a philosopher in an ancient Athenian academy and a monk under a fig tree in India. Their voices, though different in tone, both encourage us to turn away from shadowy half-truths and to strive for a more profound illumination, whether one calls it seeing the sun or attaining enlightenment. Let us begin in the darkness of the cave, where Plato sets the stage for the drama of reality and appearance. Plato's Cave, Shadows and Enlightenment. Over 2,000 years ago, Plato penned one of the most iconic metaphors in Western philosophy, the Allegory of the Cave. It appears in the Republic, where Plato has his teacher, Socrates, describe a haunting scenario to a student Glaucon. Socrates asks us to envision an underground cave used as a prison. Inside, human beings have been chained since childhood in such a way that they cannot move or turn their heads. They face a wall, and behind them blazes a fire, casting light into the cave. Between the fire and the prisoners runs a raised walkway where puppeteers unseen by the prisoners carry objects and figures, The objects cast shadows on the cave wall that the prisoners see in front of them. The prisoners have never seen anything else of the outside world. For them, the shadows are reality. They give names to these shadows and even hear echoes off the wall which they take to be the sounds of the shadows. In short, they accept the illusion of the cave as the truth, having no knowledge of the real objects or the world beyond the cave. Plato uses this grim image to symbolize the condition of unenlightened humanity. Most of us, he suggests, are like those prisoners. We take the evidence of our senses and the opinions of our society as ultimate reality without realizing there is something deeper. In the allegory, Socrates emphasizes how completely the prisoners are fooled by appearances. To them, Socrates says, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images. What they perceive, the flickering shapes and echoes, is a mere illusion, yet they do not suspect its illusory nature. If one prisoner says something and an echo bounces back, they believe the shadow spoke. If they see a shadow of a form, they assume it is the whole truth of that object. Their intellect and senses have been conditioned to accept a shadow play as the totality of existence. Plato's point is clear. Ordinary perception can be deceptive. We might be confident in what we see and hear, yet be completely wrong about what is really real. The allegory grows even more intriguing when one of the prisoners is freed. Socrates imagines what would happen if someone released a prisoner from his chains and forced him to turn around and walk up out of the cave. For the first time, the prisoner sees the figures that had cast the shadows and the fire itself. Dazzled by the firelight, he finds this new vision disorienting and painful. The immediate reaction of the liberated prisoner is not delight at truth, but confusion and discomfort. Plato writes that the freed person would suffer sharp pains, and his eyes would be blinded by the fire's glare. He would reject the new reality at first, perhaps wishing to go back to the familiar shadows. If told that what he saw before was an illusion, and now he is closer to reality, the prisoner would likely be perplexed and believe the shadows which he formerly saw were truer than the solid objects now shown to him. In other words, illusion clings tightly. Even when confronted with truth, the mind conditioned by illusion may prefer the comfortable lie over an uncomfortable reality. This is a powerful observation by Plato. Ignorance can make us resist enlightenment because the process of learning truth often requires shattering our former certainties, a painful experience. Now, suppose the prisoner is dragged further out of the cave into the world outside which he has never seen. As he emerges from the darkness, the intensity of the sunlight overwhelms him. At first, he can only make out indistinct forms and shadows, now cast by sunlight, then gradually reflections in water, then concrete objects, and finally, he can lift his eyes toward the sky. It is a gradual process of acclimation he will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. Socrates explains, bit by bit, the freed prisoner's eyes adjust. Eventually, last of all, he will be able to see the sun, not just reflections or indirect images of it, but the sun itself in its proper place. He will realize that the sun is the source of the light that illuminates everything else. It is because of the sun that he can see truth. In Plato's symbolism, the sun represents the ultimate truth, which he later identifies with the form of the good, the highest reality and the source of all understanding. The freed prisoner now, a fully enlightened philosopher, understands that the sun is the cause of all the things he and his fellow prisoners used to see as shadows. He perceives a higher reality utterly beyond the cave's dim world. With this enlightenment comes a dramatic change in perspective. The former prisoner sees his past life in the cave for what it was, a miserable delusion. Socrates asks us to imagine the enlightened person recalling the cave and the wisdom of his old fellow prisoners. Surely, Socrates says he would felicitate himself on the change and pity them. The word pity is telling. The enlightened one feels compassion or sorrow for those who remain stuck in ignorance. Plato even cites Homer to capture the liberated man's attitude: better to be the poor servant of a poor master and to endure anything rather than think as they do and live in that way. In other words, he would rather suffer any hardship in the light of truth than return to the contented ignorance of the cave. Those still in darkness might confer honors among themselves for who is best at interpreting the shadows, but the enlightened person knows those honors and truths to be worthless. Plato strikingly notes that the enlightened soul would rather suffer anything than go back to living with false notions in a wretched state. Here we see Plato's conviction that knowledge of truth is supremely valuable, worth any sacrifice, and that the ignorant life, no matter how comfortable, is fundamentally unsatisfying once you glimpse a higher reality. Plato doesn't end his allegory with the bliss of the philosopher basking in the sunlight. However, he introduces a final twist: the responsibility of enlightenment. The philosopher must return to the cave to share his discovery, even though the others will likely not understand him. Socrates imagines what would happen if the liberated man went back down into the cave to free his fellow prisoners. Suddenly re-entering the darkness, his eyes would need to readjust. He might stumble or appear confused. The prisoners still chained wouldn't recognize the outside world he describes. In fact, Plato suggests they would ridicule him. If he tried to unbind them and lead them out, they might violently resist, even to the point of killing him for disrupting their reality. This somber ending is a comment on how societies often treat their sages or truth-tellers. Socrates himself, Plato's mentor, was executed by the Athenians, much like a freed prisoner killed by those who fear the light. But it also emphasizes a key point: the enlightened individual has a duty to help others, even at great personal risk. Compassion and wisdom unite here, a theme that will resonate when we turn to the Buddha. In summary, Plato's allegory of the cave presents a multi-layered metaphor for reality and illusion. The cave's shadows are illusions, comparable to our everyday sense perceptions or popular opinions that we take as true. The painful ascent out of the cave symbolizes the philosophical journey, the struggle for education and enlightenment, which requires questioning our assumptions and enduring discomfort. The sun stands for the highest truth, the ultimate reality of the forms, especially the form of the good, that illuminates and gives meaning to everything else. And the return to the cave signifies the philosopher's role in society, to use his knowledge for the good of others, even if they reject him. Plato conveys that most humans live in a state of illusion without realizing it. However, through effort and the love of wisdom, the soul can turn from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge. This journey leads not only to intellectual insight, but to a profound transformation of one's whole being, a kind of spiritual liberation. Having seen how Plato dramatizes the human condition as being trapped in illusion and the difficult path out of it, let's travel many miles east and see how the Buddha addressed the same human predicament. Instead of shadows on a wall, the Buddha spoke of mind-made mirages. Instead of a sun representing ultimate good, he spoke of Nirvana, the extinguishing of the fires of delusion. Yet, as we'll discover, the cave and the Nirvana point to remarkably similar ideas: that what we normally call reality might be deeply unreal, and that true freedom requires a radical shift in how we perceive ourselves and the world. The Buddha's insight: impermanence and awakening from illusion. Around the 5th century BCE, roughly the same era that Socrates and Plato lived, Siddhartha Gautama, the man who would become the Buddha, embarked on his own quest to understand reality. The young Siddhartha had been shielded from life's harsh truths by his father, a king who kept him surrounded by luxury and pleasure inside palace walls. But one day, Siddhartha ventured out and encountered what came to be known as the Four Signs: an old man, a sick man, a corpse being carried to cremation, and a wandering ascetic. These sights shattered his naive perception that life was all joy. He realized that sickness, old age, and death come for everyone, that the pleasures of youth and health are transient. This realization planted the seed that ordinary life, as most people live, it might be a kind of comfortable illusion masking a fundamental truth. Everything we cherish is subject to change and loss. Disturbed and inspired, Siddhartha left his palace in search of a solution to the suffering dukkha inherent in life. After years of ascetic practice and meditation, he finally attained enlightenment Bodhi under the Bodhi tree. In that moment of profound awakening, Siddhartha, now called the Buddha, meaning the awakened one, directly saw the true nature of reality, which had eluded him and everyone else before. What did the Buddha see in his enlightenment? At the core of his insight were the three marks of existence: impermanence, anicca suffering or unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, and non-self anattā. These are fundamental characteristics of reality that most people do not fully perceive. The Buddha taught that all conditioned things, everything that arises from causes, including physical forms, feelings, thoughts, even our bodies and minds, are impermanent and constantly changing. Because we mistakenly expect things to last or satisfy us permanently, we experience dukkha, a pervasive dissatisfaction or suffering, when reality doesn't conform to our desires. And underlying these is the insight that nothing has a fixed, independent self. Neither objects nor the process we call I or me have an eternal, unchanging essence. Ignorance avidya of these truths is in Buddhism the primary cause of our bondage in a cycle of suffering, samsara. Task of enlightenment is to see through the illusions of permanence, pleasure, and self that normally dominate our perspective. The Buddha often taught these insights in a concise, punchy form. A famous example comes from the Dhammapada, a collection of the Buddha's aphorisms. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. All conditioned things are unsatisfactory. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. All things are not self. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. Each of these lines is meant to wake up the listener to a truth that we typically ignore. We tend to live as if our loved ones, our possessions, and our own lives will continue more or less as they are indefinitely. Yet impermanence is the rule. Everything that is born or assembled will eventually age, break apart, or die. We chase after experiences expecting fulfillment, yet even when we get what we want, the satisfaction doesn't last, hence dukkha. And most fundamentally, we instinctively feel that we have a solid self, a permanent I, but careful examination reveals that what we call a self is just a collection of ever-changing processes with no single unchanging core. This is the startling doctrine of non-self, which declares that clinging to the idea of me and mine is a deep delusion at the heart of human suffering. These truths might sound abstract, but the Buddha taught them through vivid examples and concrete metaphors, much as Plato taught through the allegory of the cave. One powerful Buddhist metaphor comes from a discourse known as the Fina Sutta. In it, the Buddha describes the 5 aggregates, the components of a person's experience, using imagery of insubstantial fleeting phenomena. Form is like a glob of foam, feeling a bubble, perception a mirage, fabrications mental formations a banana tree, consciousness a magic trick, declared the Buddha. Each comparison drives home how insubstantial and deceptive our experiences are. A lump of foam on the river has shape but no solidity. It would collapse in your hand. So too our physical form has appearance, but no lasting essence. A feeling or sensation is as fleeting as a water bubble. Our perceptions are likened to a mirage. We see a shimmer and think it's water, but it's an illusion created by conditions. Our mental formations are compared to the soft core of a banana tree trunk. When you peel it away, there's nothing solid at the center. And consciousness, the very awareness that experiences all this, the Buddha compares to a magic trick or illusion. This is striking. Even our consciousness is not a reliable, independent self. It's a phenomenon that arises and passes based on conditions like a skilled illusionist show fooling an audience. The refrain after these images is that one who observes these aggregates properly sees that they're empty, void of any essence. In other words, the world as we experience it is empty of permanence, empty of any self. It is fundamentally illusory when clung to as real. This does not mean nothing exists at all. Rather, what does exist is dynamic, interdependent, and empty of enduring substance. Another beautiful image appears in the Dhammapada to illustrate how an enlightened perspective views the world. Just as a bubble may be seen just as a faint mirage, so should the world be viewed. One who sees the world as a bubble or mirage. The verse concludes is not seen by the king of death, a poetic way of saying they escape Mara, the tempter, and the cycle of death and rebirth. This small verse encapsulates the Buddha's message about illusion. The wise person regards the whole world, all of conditioned existence, as comparable to a soap bubble or a mirage in the desert, appearing real from a distance but empty upon closer inspection. We can see a parallel between the Buddha's imagery and Plato's cave. Plato's prisoners took shadows for reality. Unenlightened beings in Buddhist thought take the foam and bubbles of transitory phenomena as if they were solid and lasting. Plato's liberated prisoner sees the sun and realizes the shadows were false. Likewise, the Buddha woke up and saw that the world we normally perceive is pervaded by illusion. Not shadows cast by a fire, but illusions created by our own cravings, aversions, and ignorance. Upon enlightenment, tradition says the Buddha exclaimed, "Through countless births, I have wandered seeking but not finding the builder of this house of life. Now I have seen you, house builder. You shall not build this house again. Its rafters are broken, its ridgepole shattered. My mind has attained the unconditioned." This metaphorical verse expresses the insight that he had finally caught the culprit that builds the illusion of self and samsara, that culprit being craving and ignorance, and by doing so, he had dismantled the illusions that kept him wandering in ignorance. There is a crucial difference in tone between the two teachings. However, Plato's allegory presents a kind of two-tier reality, the false world of shadows and the true world outside. In some interpretations, this corresponds to Plato's theory of forms, where the everyday things we see are imperfect copies or reflections of eternal, unchanging forms. The ultimate form is the good, which is to the intelligible world as the sun is to the visible world. It illuminates all truth and is the source of being. Thus, Plato doesn't say the physical world is utterly non-existent or a complete deception. Rather, it has a derivative reality. The beauty or goodness we see in this world is a reflection of a higher, truer reality. The Buddha's perspective, especially in Theravada Buddhism, is somewhat different. He does not posit an eternal realm of perfect forms behind phenomena. Instead, he suggests that any phenomenon you can point to, any form, feeling idea, even any state of consciousness, is marked by impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self. Reality in Buddhism is often described as having two levels: the conventional truth, how things appear and function in daily life, and the ultimate truth, how things truly are when seen with insight. Conventionally, we talk about persons, selves, and objects. Ultimately, those things dissolve upon analysis into impersonal processes or emptiness. The Buddha was famously wary of metaphysical speculation. He often compared his teaching to a raft that is meant to carry one across the river of suffering to the shore of enlightenment, and should be let go after use, implying that clinging to doctrines or concepts of ultimate reality could become a hindrance. The Buddha wanted practitioners to experience nirvana rather than theorize about it. That said, Buddhism does speak of an ultimate truth or reality in a negative fashion, by describing what it is not. The nirvana that the Buddha realized under the Bodhi tree is not a thing or a place, but rather the unconditioned state beyond all impermanent phenomena. The Buddha described it thus: there is monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned. If there were not that unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, no escape would be discerned from what is born, become made, conditioned. But because there is an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, an escape is discerned from what is born, become made, and conditioned. This quote assures us that nirvana is real in the sense that it is the escape from the world of change and illusion. It's somewhat analogous to Plato's sun or the realm outside the cave. It's a state of absolute freedom and truth in contrast to the conditioned world we normally inhabit. However, unlike Plato's form of the good, which is a positive principle giving reality to things, nirvana is described more by what it isn't. No birth, no death, no suffering. It is the cessation of all conditioned existence, and therefore the end of illusion and dissatisfaction. The Buddha called it the sorrowless, undefiled, supremely blissful security from bondage, and simply the deathless. So while Plato envisions rising to a highest entity, the good that illuminates reality, the Buddha's enlightenment consists in extinguishing the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. Hence, the literal meaning of nirvana is blowing out or quenching, like a flame being extinguished. What remains is not annihilation, but an unconditioned peace beyond the conceptual dualities of existence and non-existence. The key takeaway is that, for Buddhism, ultimate truth isn't an object of thought, but a direct realization that transcends the illusions of this world. In summary, both Buddha and Plato saw ordinary human life as entangled in illusion, but they framed the nature of that illusion differently. Plato saw our world as real yet deficient, a shadow of a higher reality of forms. The illusion was taking the shadow for the real thing. Buddha saw our world as transient and conditional. The illusion is believing it has permanence, satisfiability, or self. For Plato, enlightenment is like seeing the sun, a positive vision of the source of truth and goodness, enabling one to understand reality. For the Buddha, enlightenment, nirvana is like blowing out a lamp, the end of the flickering projections leading to a state beyond all conditional reality, enabling one to be free from suffering. Yet, in practical terms, both emphasize that most people live in ignorance of these truths and thus remain spiritually in the dark. Both call on us to undergo a profound transformation in how we perceive reality, to wake up from the illusions that bind us. The illusion of self-soul versus non-self. One particular facet of reality and illusion where Plato and the Buddha dramatically diverge is the question of the self. Essentially, what are we, and do we have a true lasting essence? This topic is crucial because it underlies how each system conceives liberation. If there is one place where the Buddha's perspective and Plato's might seem almost opposite, it is here. Plato's view of the self is rooted in the idea of an immortal soul psyche. In dialogues like the Phaedo, Plato through Socrates argues that what we truly are is a soul temporarily imprisoned in a body. The body with its senses and appetites is often described by Socrates as a hindrance to acquiring truth and wisdom. Socrates on the day of his execution discusses how a true philosopher practices for death by separating the soul from bodily influences as much as possible. He says, for instance, the body is a source of endless trouble to us. It fills us with lusts and fears and all sorts of fancies, and hinders us from seeing the truth. Only when the soul is free from the distractions of the body can it grasp reality in its pure form. Socrates goes so far as to claim that if we would have pure knowledge, the soul in itself must behold things in themselves, and the soul is only truly itself, and able to see truth when it is liberated from the body. Hence, in Plato's thought, the soul, the true self, is something real and enduring, capable of knowing eternal truths, like the forms. The body and the material world are relatively less real, or at least less trustworthy, constantly changing and deceiving the soul. Plato even gives arguments for the immortality of the soul in the Phaedo, suggesting that the soul will persist and perhaps contemplate truth even more fully after death, once liberated from physical confines. For Plato, then, the journey out of the cave can be seen as the soul's journey to recall its true nature and the true realities, the forms it once knew before being born into this world of flux. The illusion at the personal level in the Platonic view is to identify with the body and the sensory self rather than with the rational immortal soul. The enlightened person realizes, I am not principally a body that sees shadows. I am a soul akin to the divine, and I can turn toward the light of truth. Plato's emphasis on rational insight and recollection of the forms is predicated on the soul being something divine and unchanging in essence, capable of recognizing unchanging truth because it is itself not a merely transient thing. Now contrast this with the Buddha's doctrine of non-self anattā. This doctrine was one of the Buddha's most radical teachings, directly challenging the prevailing beliefs in his Indian context, where most philosophies assumed an eternal soul or Atman. The Buddha taught that no permanent, unchanging self can be found in any aspect of our being. He systematically applied this analysis to the 5 aggregates: body feelings, perceptions, mental formations, consciousness. In the Anattā Lakkhana Sutta, the discourse on the characteristic of non-self, the Buddha asked, is any of these aggregates fit to be regarded as, this is mine, this is what I am, this is myself? The answer was no. Each of them is impermanent and not under one's complete control, thus not truly self. In another well-known formula, he stated, whatever is of the nature to arise is of the nature to cease, implying that nothing that arises and ceases, which is everything conditioned, can be a lasting self. The Dhammapada verse 279 concisely states, Sabbe Dhamma anattā, all things phenomena are not self. This means from the Buddhist perspective that the sense of an I who perceives and a world out there that is perceived are both part of the grand illusion. There is no ghost in the machine, no hidden soul inside us that is the real me. The very craving for and clinging to a notion of I and mine is what perpetuates suffering. Liberation nirvana in Buddhism crucially involves letting go of the illusion of self. When the Buddha attained enlightenment, he directly saw past selfhood. He realized that what we call a person is just a stream of events, mental and physical phenomena arising and passing, without a static core. The ignorance of vidya at the root of suffering is often described as misapprehending self in what is not self, for example, taking the body to be I, or taking thoughts to be mine. The enlightened individual has uprooted this illusion. They no longer think in terms of I am, or I was, or I will be. This doesn't mean they become a blank automaton. Rather, they function without egoistic grasping. They are said to be truly released precisely because there is no more clinging to a self that could be hurt, offended, or that would crave satisfaction. To the uninitiated, the Buddhist no-self doctrine can sound nihilistic. If there's no self, what is it that gets enlightened or experiences nirvana? But Buddhism navigates this by explaining that nirvana is not experienced by a self. It is the cessation of the very illusion of that experiencer. It must be realized, not merely conceptualized. The Buddha in one discourse refused to be drawn on whether an enlightened being exists or doesn't exist after death, because the question itself presupposed a fixed entity. He likened such questions to asking where a flame goes when it's extinguished. It doesn't go north, south, east, or west. It simply stops because the fuel is gone. When we compare Plato and Buddha on the self, we find a fundamental divergence in doctrine. Plato posits an eternal soul as the true self, making him in some sense a dualist, soul versus body, and an idealist, believing in metaphysical souls and forms, whereas the Buddha is often seen as an anti-essentialist, denying any eternal substrate of self, either in body or mind. One could humorously say that Plato's philosophy is about discovering your true self with a capital S, while Buddhism is about discovering that you have no self. However, there is an interesting convergence in practice. Both encourage a kind of detachment from the ordinary ego or bodily identity. The Platonic philosopher strives to identify with the rational soul and its love for truth rather than with bodily desires. The Buddhist monk strives to see through the notion of self, and thus is no longer ruled by egoistic desire or aversion. In both cases, there is a movement towards an existence not centered on the physical mortal me that fears and craves. Another surprising commonality, both Plato and Buddha compare the body or mundane existence to a prison. Plato speaks of the soul imprisoned in the cave of the body and ignorance. The Buddha, in a famous image from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, described the cycle of rebirth and death as a prison or an ocean to be crossed, and he referred to himself as having been freed from the snare of Mara. Both acknowledge that escape requires effort and insight, but for Plato, it is the soul's ascent to the realm of forms. For Buddha, it is the extinguishing of the delusion of soul. This difference in views of self also leads to differences in the portrayal of the enlightened person. Plato's enlightened philosopher, having found truth, still retains individuality. Indeed, a kind of heroic individuality. He or she is the one fit to rule as a philosopher king to guide society because they know what justice and the good truly are. The Buddha or Arhat, on the other hand, has no interest in worldly power or ruling others. Having realized non-self, they act out of compassion and wisdom, but without ego. The Buddha gathered disciples to teach not to rule them, and he established the Sangha as a fellowship of practice rather than a hierarchy of political control. An enlightened Buddhist being might even appear outwardly ordinary or humble, defined by what they lack: greed, hatred, pride, delusion. Plato's philosopher might be more overtly authoritative. He or she knows more than others. The Buddha would say the arahant is distinguished by being free of craving and delusion, not by asserting selfhood. This contrast highlights a broader philosophical difference. Platonic idealism versus Buddhist empiricism. Plato is searching for something eternal to hold on to, an eternal truth, and an eternal soul. The Buddha is inclined to let go of any notion of eternity, at least in the personal sense, to reach a state beyond all clinging. In modern terms, some scholars describe Buddhism as a kind of phenomenological analysis of experience, breaking it down without positing metaphysical entities, whereas Platonism is a metaphysical system positing a hierarchy of being from matter up to pure form. However, despite these differences, both traditions emphasize that the ordinary way we see ourselves is deeply flawed. Plato would say we mistake our ego and body for our true self, which should instead be identified with the rational soul. Buddha would say we mistake the aggregates for a self, when in truth there is no such self to be found. In either case, to progress towards enlightenment, one must undergo a profound shift in self-perception. We must, in a sense, lose ourselves to find the truth, whether that means losing attachment to the body and identifying with the soul, Plato, or losing the illusion of any personal self-Buddha. In practical terms, this often manifests as ego transcendence. The Platonic philosopher trains in virtues, self-control, courage, justice, piety, which all involve putting reason, the higher self, above the lower urges. The Buddhist practitioner trains in morality, sila concentration, samadhi and wisdom, panya to uproot self-centered craving and ignorance. Both are disciplines of self-transformation aiming at a liberated state of being. The path out of the cave and the path to Nirvana. We have explored the nature of the illusion and the reality posited by Plato and the Buddha. But how does one actually move from illusion to reality, from the cave to the sunlight, from samsara to nirvana? Both systems lay out a path of practice because enlightenment or release doesn't happen by mere wishful thinking. It requires a reorientation of one's entire life. Here we find both striking parallels and important differences in emphasis. Plato's path, though not a formal path in the same way Buddhism has, one can be gleaned from the Republic and other dialogues. It is fundamentally a path of education paideia and philosophical inquiry. Plato saw education not just as feeding information, but as a turning of the soul from darkness toward light. The allegory of the cave itself is a commentary on education. The prisoner is freed perhaps by a teacher figure and compelled to make the ascent. In the Republic, after the cave allegory, Plato describes the ideal education for the future philosopher kings. It begins with physical training and basic arts, but advances to mathematics and geometry, which teach abstract thinking, and culminates in dialectic, the practice of philosophical dialogue that leads the mind toward the form of the good. The ascent from seeing shadows to seeing real objects, to seeing the heavens and finally the sun, corresponds to the mind's ascent from opinion to scientific understanding to philosophical understanding of the highest principles. Importantly, Plato insists that virtue is a prerequisite and a result of true education. One must have a just and disciplined character to even grasp higher truths safely. If someone tried to approach the good without proper training, they could become dazzled or turn out unscrupulous. Thus, the philosopher's path is also a moral path. It requires developing the cardinal virtues, wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice in one's soul. Each part of the soul, reason, spirit, appetite, in Plato's psychology, must do its proper function under the guidance of reason, analogous to how each class in his ideal society does its part under the guidance of the ruling philosophers. In the cave allegory, the freed prisoner's eyes adjust gradually. He first sees shadows, then reflections, then things, then the sun. Similarly, knowledge is built up step by step. One might start by recognizing the flaws in one's former beliefs, then learning about the forms of things, and finally grasping the unity of all in the good. Plato doesn't give a step-by-step meditation manual. Rather, he gives us the image of an upward journey aided by teachers and discussion. The contemplation of truth, and especially of the form of good, is the pinnacle. In the Symposium, Plato describes a ladder of love, where one starts by loving a single beautiful body, then all beautiful bodies, then beautiful minds, then beautiful laws and institutions, and eventually the form of beauty itself. Another metaphor for ascending from concrete to abstract, from sensual to intellectual to spiritual love. All these metaphors boil down to one idea: philosophical wisdom through rigorous inquiry, and virtue is the way out of ignorance. It's a path for the mind and for the soul's purification. Now the Buddha's path is explicitly formulated as the Noble Eightfold Path, first expounded in his Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion, which was his first sermon after enlightenment. The Eightfold Path consists of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. These are often grouped into three trainings: wisdom, right view and intention ethics, right speech, action, livelihood and mental discipline, right effort, mindfulness, concentration. This holistic path is how one dismantles the causes of illusion and suffering in oneself. Let's draw parallels. Right view is placed first. It means seeing reality correctly, especially understanding the Four Noble Truths about suffering and the possibility of liberation. This is akin to beginning to turn one's head towards the light, recognizing that what we commonly pursue might not be ultimate. Right intention means aligning one's motives with renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness rather than with desire, ill will, or cruelty. In Plato's terms, we might say, the philosopher must have a love of truth and a benevolent spirit. Then the path emphasizes moral discipline, not lying or speaking harshly, right speech, not harming others or engaging in unethical behavior, right action, and earning a livelihood in a way that doesn't cause suffering, right livelihood. This emphasis on ethics is critical, much like Plato's insistence that the soul must be just and orderly to grasp higher truths. The Buddha knew that if one's life is morally chaotic or one continues to fuel greed and dishonesty, one cannot hope to perceive reality as it is. Ethical conduct purifies the mind and lays the groundwork for insight. Next, the Buddha prescribes mental cultivation. Right effort means making diligent, balanced effort to abandon unwholesome states of mind and cultivate wholesome states. Right mindfulness involves developing constant awareness of one's body, feelings, mind, and phenomena, observing them without clinging or aversion. Right concentration refers to training the mind to become deeply focused and tranquil. These practices help one to experientially see the moment-to-moment arising and passing of phenomena, thereby directly perceiving impermanence and non-self. As the Dhammapada says, wisdom springs from meditation. Without meditation, wisdom wanes. The culmination of this training is profound insight, vipassana, that eradicates ignorance at the root. In effect, the Buddhist path is a method of deconditioning and reconditioning the mind. We decondition our habitual reactions and illusions by ethical living and mindfulness. We recondition the mind toward wisdom by repeated reflection on the Dhamma and by practicing concentration and insight. It is a transformative process that involves one's whole being, intellectual understanding, ethical behavior, and inward contemplative realization. Plato's approach leans more toward the intellectual and rational with a dose of moral requirements, whereas the Buddha's approach is more experiential and psychological. Plato wants us to use reason to question and ascend beyond the senses. The Buddha wants us to observe experience carefully and let wisdom grow from seeing things as they are. There is, however, overlap. Both emphasize detachment from sense pleasures as essential. Plato shows how one must turn away from the play of shadows to seek the higher good. The Buddha explicitly taught the danger of sensual attachment and advocated renunciation and contentment. Both traditions highlight the need for a teacher or guide. Plato had Socrates. The Buddha had his own teachers in early life and then became the teacher. The Buddhist tradition emphasizes the Sangha, community, and qualified instruction. Plato's academy likewise depended on dialogue and mentorship. What about compassion and helping others on the path? Plato's enlightened one is supposed to go back into the cave to help those still in darkness, even if it's arduous. The Buddha, after enlightenment, also hesitated to teach thinking. This Dhamma is profound and hard to see. Maybe no one will understand. But out of compassion, he chose to teach. He spent the next 45 years walking across India to share what he had realized. Both figures exemplify the idea that true enlightenment carries a responsibility to assist others who are suffering in illusion. We might ask, what is the end goal like according to each? For Plato, the end goal is the contemplation of the good and living in accordance with truth and justice. The philosopher lives a life of wisdom and virtue, the happiest life possible. The cave dweller who has seen the sun lives with understanding, not fooled by the prizes and fears of the cave. For the Buddha, the end goal is nirvana, described as peace, freedom, and the highest happiness. An enlightened person experiences a mind free from greed, hatred, and delusion. They live in equanimity and compassion. At death, they attain parinirvana, complete final liberation. Not a place, but a cessation of all conditioned becoming. It's a state beyond our conceptual grasp, yet one regarded as the end of all suffering, the unshakable liberation of mind. One striking commonality is how both traditions use the language of awakening or illumination. The Buddha is literally the awakened one, implying the rest of us are asleep in a dream. Plato's imagery of coming into the light of day from darkness carries a similar connotation. Light imagery abounds in both. Plato's form of good is the sun. The Buddha speaks of bringing the Dhamma eye, or the light of knowledge. As one disciple said of the Buddha, it is as if one might set upright what had been overturned, or reveal what was hidden, or point the way to one who was lost, or hold up a lamp in the dark for those with eyes to see forms. That image of holding up a lamp in the dark resonates strongly with Plato's metaphor of turning to the light. Both Buddha and Plato see themselves as guides leading others out of darkness. Conclusion: from the cave to nirvana. We have journeyed a long way, from the shadowy depths of Plato's cave to the liberating insight under the Buddha's Bodhi tree. Along the way, we have seen two great minds diagnose the human condition in remarkably resonant terms. Human beings are prone to mistaking illusion for reality, and this mistake causes our suffering, or at least our failure to achieve true fulfillment. For Plato, These illusions are like shadows on a wall, mere appearances and opinions that we take as real until philosophy turns us toward the light of truth. For the Buddha, illusions pervade our experience. In the permanence we project onto changing things, in the satisfaction we seek from unsatisfactory things, and in the self we imagine where there is no fixed self. Enlightenment for the Buddha is seeing things as they really are, yatha bhutanyana, dasana. Just as enlightenment for Plato is knowing what truly is to own reality, as opposed to what merely seems to be. Despite their different cultural contexts and conceptual frameworks, there is a profound common ground between the two. Both depict ordinary human life as lived in a state of bondage or captivity to ignorance. Plato gives us prisoners in a cave. Buddhism speaks of beings trapped in samsara, bound by the fetters of craving and delusion. Both emphasize that liberation is possible through a radical shift in understanding. The prisoner can break free and see the sun. The ordinary person can awaken and see nirvana. There is an ultimate truth that redeems and frees. Both stress that the process is not easy. It involves pain or difficulty. Plato's prisoner feels pain and confusion adjusting to light. The Buddhist path asks us to confront uncomfortable truths about impermanent suffering and our lack of a self, which can be unsettling. The journey requires courage, persistence, and often guidance. Both highlight ethics and self-discipline as crucial. The cave escapee must have the fortitude to handle truth. The philosopher must be virtuous. The Buddhist must practice moral conduct and mental discipline. Ethical purification is part of seeing reality correctly. Both end in a state of extraordinary freedom and clarity. Plato's liberated individual moves in the broad daylight, seeing truly and living by wisdom. The Buddha, or Arahant, is said to be freed from the seamstress of craving and abides in peace, having understood the world and its gods, meaning understood all that is to be understood about reality. However, we also have appreciated the differences and uniqueness of each approach. Plato gives us a vision of a higher eternal reality, the forms and the good, which imbues this world with whatever reality it has. The Buddha refrains from positing eternal forms. Instead, he focuses on the process of phenomena and their emptiness. Plato retains a notion of a true self, the soul that apprehends truth. The Buddha deliberately dismantles any clinging to a self in order to reach the truth. Plato's enlightenment is intellectual moral insight. The Buddha's is experiential moral insight. Though both are transformative, the flavor is different. One could say Plato seeks truth. The Buddha seeks freedom. But that might be oversimplifying, because Plato saw truth as freeing and ennobling, and the Buddha certainly taught truth, Dhamma, as the means to freedom. Perhaps it's better to say Plato emphasizes knowing reality. Buddha emphasizes letting go of delusions to realize reality, Plato's highest reality. Good one can be thought of as something to unite with. Buddha's highest reality, nirvana, is more like a state of cessation to be reached by relinquishment. In ethical import, Plato's liberated one ideally becomes a wise ruler. The Buddha's liberated one often becomes a teacher or simply a sage who might live quietly or teach others the path, but in either case is compassionate to all. In terms of legacy, Plato's cave allegory has influenced centuries of thought. The Buddha's teaching on illusion and enlightenment has profoundly shaped Eastern thought and is increasingly known worldwide. For a moment, let's imagine an encounter between Plato and the Buddha, not as a literal debate, but as a meeting of minds. They might find in each other kindred spirits both devoted to the pursuit of the highest. Plato might speak of the form of the good and the illumination of the soul. The Buddha might nod and speak of nirvana, the highest peace and the illumination of wisdom. Plato might express frustration at how people cling to their perceived reality and resist philosophy. The Buddha would sympathize, recounting how he was initially hesitant to teach because people are so attached to their views and pleasures that to this generation beings delighting in sensual pleasures, it is hard to see the profound truth. Both understood the inertia of ignorance. Where might they disagree? Plato might inquire about the soul and the Buddha might give his teaching of anattā, that clinging to the idea of soul is a fetter. Plato might be taken aback. Without a soul, how can there be morality or continuity? The Buddha might respond with the teaching of dependent origination, that life is a flow of causes and effects, not a fixed identity. In the end, both would agree on this: the highest wisdom cannot be simply talked about, it must be experienced. Plato has Socrates say that ultimately the idea of the good is only truly understood by direct apprehension. The Buddha consistently said that nirvana is to be personally realized. Ehipassiko, inviting one to come and see. Both were somewhat distrustful of language to convey the ultimate truth. Plato often resorted to myths and allegories, the Buddha to similes or silence. For us in the modern day, the lessons from both remain as relevant as ever. Plato asks us, what shadows are we mistaking for reality in our lives? Are we so enamored with the flickering images on our screens that we miss a deeper engagement with truth and virtue? He challenges us to turn off the shadows and seek the light of knowledge. The Buddha asks us, what are we clinging to that is impermanent? Do we see how our own desires and aversions cloud our perception? He invites us to observe, to meditate, to realize that everything that arises will pass, that only by letting go can we find peace. Both invite us to a kind of awakening. Plato's is an intellectual spiritual awakening. To the eternal Buddha's is a mindful spiritual awakening to the unconditioned. Both traditions converge on the idea that living in truth leads to compassionate action. When one sees clearly, one realizes the folly of selfish pursuits. Plato's philosopher works for justice in the city. The Buddha, out of great compassion, spent decades sharing the path out of suffering. True wisdom doesn't lead to detachment alone. It leads to caring for others who are still struggling in the dark. After the Enlightenment, the laundry, meaning that an enlightened person still goes about the humble tasks of life, but now with a heart free and full of compassion. In closing, the saga of the cave and Nirvana teaches us that waking up is possible, and it is the highest calling of a human life. Whether we use the language of Greek philosophy or Buddhist teaching, we learn that our ordinary reality might be akin to dreaming, and waking up will require effort, courage, and guidance. We learn that reality, when finally seen, is far more magnificent and liberating than the fantasies we leave behind. And we learn that those who have awakened beckon us forward. Plato and the Buddha across time beckon us to see for ourselves. The cave and the Bodhi tree are mirrors reflecting our own situation and potential. Are we content to play with shadows, or will we seek the light? Will we cling to our illusions, or dare to let go and discover the truth of things as they are? The Buddha's gentle voice would encourage: open your eyes, see the world as a bubble, a mirage. Do not be afraid to let go, for what you gain is far greater than what you lose. Plato's earnest voice would urge: use your reason, ask questions, turn around from the wall and behold the light. It will be hard at first, but your soul was made for the truth. Both promise a form of liberation, one ultimately moral and intellectual, the other moral and spiritual. In both, there is the joy of discovery, seeing the sun, seeing nirvana. In our own lives, perhaps, we can take inspiration from both these teachers. We can cultivate the Socratic spirit of questioning appearances and seeking wisdom, and we can cultivate the Buddhist spirit of mindful awareness and compassion, loosening our attachments. In doing so, we slowly inch toward the mouth of our own cave, climb toward our own awakening. As we do, we might recall that countless others have made this journey and left us guidance. The path from the cave to nirvana is the perennial human journey, the hero's journey of consciousness itself. And when we stumble in the dark or feel the glare of truth is too strong, we can remember the reassurance both traditions give: the effort is worth it. The sunlight of the good and the cool moonlight of nirvana's peace are worth every step of the ascent. The Buddha encouraged his disciples by pointing out the bliss of liberation, saying, "It is visible here and now, not delayed for those who awaken." Plato assured that the philosopher, even if ridiculed by others, lives a life far happier than those chasing shadows, because only the philosopher experiences true fulfillment. In the end, the Buddha and Plato together teach us that reality, when known, is transformative. It changes who we are, and illusion, when seen through, loses its power over us. Their lives themselves bear witness. One, a prince turned sage who attained perfect peace and radiated loving kindness. The other, an aristocrat turned philosopher who devoted himself to truth and whose ideas enlightened civilizations. They urge us each in his way to make that journey from darkness to light, from the cave of our ignorance to the nirvana of true understanding. The journey is both outward and inward. Outward, we step beyond conventional beliefs and dare to question everything. Inward, we confront our own minds, our desires, fears, and illusions with honesty and clarity. Few tasks could be more daunting, but none could be more meaningful. Let their examples inspire us. If we persevere, we too might, even if briefly, catch a glimpse of the world beyond illusions. A glimpse of a reality that liberates. The chains were never lock and key. They were chains of our own misunderstandings, easily melted by the light of wisdom. From the cave to nirvana is ultimately from here to here. It is discovering, as the Buddha did, the unborn freedom that was always possible. Or, as Plato might say, the good that always illumined our world, if only we attune our eyes to it. Come out of the dark, see what is real. Know yourself or realize no self. The truth will set you free.